There's a moment that happens to almost every human being, and most of us never even notice when it begins. Someone says something careless. A certain look lingers too long. A message never arrives. A notification stays silent. And somehow, without asking for permission, your entire inner world shifts. The mind starts racing in circles. Your chest tightens like invisible hands are pressing against it. You replay the same scene over and over again, building arguments you'll never actually use, defending yourself against people who are already asleep, already gone, already living somewhere far outside the storm now consuming you. And maybe the strangest part isn't even the pain itself. Maybe the strangest part is realizing how easily your peace can be taken from you. How quickly your emotional state can be rearranged by a sentence, a tone, a glance, a silence. It's realizing how cheaply we've learned to trade away our inner stability. So if you've been feeling this lately, stay here with me for a moment, because this conversation may become one of the most important conversations you have with yourself this year. And no, I'm not going to tell you to stop caring. That would be dishonest. You'd hear the emptiness in those words immediately. Human beings are not made of stone, and pretending we are is just another performance, another mask people wear to hide how deeply they're affected by the world around them. What I want to offer you is quieter than that, more precise, a different way of moving through reality where things can still touch you, but no longer possess you. Because here's the truth most people never say out loud. When you react to everything, you become predictable. And anything predictable can be controlled. Every time you explode emotionally, every time you over-explain yourself where no explanation was even requested, every time your eyes silently beg someone to notice your value, you hand away another piece of your power. And the strange irony is that we think we're protecting ourselves while we're actually teaching the world exactly which buttons to press to destabilize us. Think about your own life for a second. How many times this week did your mood depend on someone else? A message, a tone of voice, an opinion that wasn't even truly about you. We've been conditioned to believe this is normal. That being emotionally hijacked is simply part of being human. That feeling everything intensely means we're deep people. But there's a difference between feeling and being dragged. A difference between caring and being consumed. A difference between living consciously and simply reacting automatically. What we're talking about here is not a trick, not a technique, not some temporary mindset hack. It's a posture, a way of being that ancient traditions have pointed toward for thousands of years, and that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. It lives in the quiet space between what happens outside you and what you choose to create within yourself afterward. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived suffering most people cannot even imagine, once said that within that space lies our freedom. Everything we are, everything we can become. And maybe as you hear these words, something inside you already recognizes them. A subtle shift, a quiet remembering. Like some deeper part of you has always known this truth, but forgot how to listen beneath the noise. So let me be honest with you. This conversation goes deep. And by the end of it, something inside you may never react the same way again. Because most of what shakes us is not actually reality itself. It's the story we tell ourselves about reality. And that distinction changes everything. Think about the last time something truly disturbed you. Not the surface version you tell people casually. The real version. The one that kept you awake at night replaying conversations in your head, imagining alternate responses, creating entire futures from one painful moment. If you look closely, you'll notice something almost unsettling. The actual event probably lasted seconds, maybe a minute, but the suffering lasted hours, days, sometimes years. Why? Because human beings rarely react to reality directly. We react to interpretation. And those interpretations are shaped by every wound we never healed, every fear we inherited, every unconscious story we accepted without ever questioning. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Stoics understood this with astonishing clarity. Epictetus, a man born into slavery who later became one of history's most influential philosophers, said something humanity still struggles to fully hear. It's not events themselves that disturb us, but the meaning we attach to them. The event itself is neutral. The wound lives in the interpretation. And strangely enough, that's where our power begins. Because if meaning is something we create, then meaning is also something we can change. I know that sounds simple, maybe even too simple, but its depth only reveals itself in lived experience. In those moments when you suddenly catch yourself mid-reaction and realize with a kind of silent shock that you've been unconsciously authoring your own suffering. Most of us grew up believing other people control how we feel, that circumstances dictate our inner state. That peace will finally arrive once the world behaves correctly around us. But peace doesn't work that way. Peace is not the absence of disturbance. Peace is what remains when you stop feeding the disturbance with your own mind, your own emotional momentum, your own unconscious broadcast into the world around you. And eventually, somewhere between the ages of 25 and 45, many people begin to feel exhausted by their own reactions. They start noticing the same emotional patterns repeating themselves again and again. Different faces, different relationships, different environments. Yet somehow the exact same emotional script keeps replaying. First it's the boss, then the partner, then the friend, then the parent, until one quiet day, a terrifying possibility begins to emerge. Maybe the common thread was never them. Maybe the common thread is the one inside you watching it all unfold. The one who keeps walking into the same fire hoping it won't burn this time. It's not an easy realization, but it's the one that begins liberation. Because the moment you realize you've been participating in your own emotional chaos is the exact moment you discover you can stop. Not through force, not through suppression, but through awareness itself. Most people never realize this part of themselves even exists. They live completely identified with the noise inside their own minds. Every thought feels like truth. Every emotion feels like identity. Every impulse feels like destiny pulling them forward. But sit with this for a moment, because this single realization can change the structure of your entire inner world. If you can observe a thought, then you are not the thought. And if you can watch an emotion rise, intensify, and eventually dissolve, then you are not that emotion either. There is something deeper underneath all of it. Something that existed before the storm arrived and remains after the storm has passed. That deeper presence is what we are trying to reconnect with now. Not because it disappeared, but because the world became too loud for us to hear it clearly anymore. And the moment you begin cultivating this observer within yourself, something fascinating starts happening. The same situations that once shattered your emotional balance begin to feel strangely different. Not because reality changed, but because for the first time, you found a place to stand that isn't trapped inside the wave itself. Slowly, you begin noticing the gap. That tiny, almost invisible space between what happens and how you respond to it. In the beginning, the gap feels microscopic, maybe half a second, maybe less. But with awareness, the space widens. And inside that widening, your entire life begins reorganizing itself. Think of the gap like the distance between a lit match and dry fuel. When there is no space, the spark instantly becomes fire. Something happens, and before you even realize it, you're already burning. The message arrives, the comment lands, the tone changes, and suddenly your entire nervous system is consumed. But when space exists, even the smallest amount, something entirely different happens. The spark still appears. The trigger still enters the room. But now it lands in open air instead of directly onto fuel. And most of the time, it burns itself out before it ever reaches anything important inside you. This is what most people misunderstand about non-reaction. They think it means suppression. But suppression is trapping the fire inside yourself. Non-reaction is simply removing the fuel that keeps the fire alive. You can see this clearly in people who have spent years doing deep inner work. Someone throws a sharp comment at them, and you watch carefully. There's no flinch, no immediate contraction, no tightening in the face, just a quiet pause. And inside that pause, the entire emotional charge dissolves before it can fully form. The insult travels through the air, reaches them, and finds nothing combustible to attach itself to. So it simply disappears. That isn't coldness. That isn't indifference. That is the result of years spent widening the inner space between stimulus and reaction, breath by breath, moment by moment, until what once detonated their entire emotional field now barely creates a ripple. Because inside that gap lives choice. Inside that gap lives dignity. Inside that gap lives the difference between consciously living your life and unconsciously being dragged through it. And here's something deeply important about people who cultivate this kind of inner coherence. They do not become emotionally distant. If anything, They become more present than everyone around them. They listen without interrupting. They respond without scrambling to defend themselves. They hold space for others without absorbing what was never theirs to carry. And when something truly matters, they engage with a depth reactive people rarely reach. That's the paradox most people miss. The less reactive you become, the more fully present you are. The less your attention is scattered by every passing disturbance, the more energy becomes available for what genuinely deserves it. But most of us were taught the opposite. We learned to confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. We believed that if we didn't react strongly, it meant we didn't care enough. That composure meant repression. That detachment meant emotional coldness. But there are two kinds of caring. One destroys you. The other sustains you. One leaves your nervous system exhausted, fragmented, constantly searching for validation. The other leaves you whole. And what we are learning here is the second kind. Slowly. Honestly. Without pretending we've already mastered it. Because there's something uncomfortable we need to face directly. Much of what we call sensitivity is actually addiction. Addiction to being seen. Addiction to being validated. Addiction to being right. Addiction to constantly reinforcing the identity story we already carry about ourselves. When someone criticizes us and we spiral emotionally, it's rarely about the criticism itself. It's about the ancient wound the criticism touched. The hidden voice underneath it whispering, "See? This proves you were never enough." And when someone ignores us and we collapse internally, it's rarely about that specific person. It's about every moment in our past when we felt invisible, abandoned, emotionally unseen, and the body instantly remembering the emotional frequency of those old experiences. This is why the present moment can feel disproportionately painful. We are not reacting only to what is happening now. We are reacting to thousands of unresolved moments that the present accidentally awakened. And this is why shallow advice never works. Just let it go. Just stop caring. Just move on. We've all heard those phrases. And something inside us instantly resists them because we know human consciousness doesn't work that way. You cannot release what you haven't understood. You cannot heal what you refuse to look at directly. The mind may try to skip over pain, but the body remembers everything. So before we can truly understand how to stop being affected so easily, we first need to understand why we became so affected in the first place. Most people are walking through adult life with an emotional operating system that was built when they were 5 years old, maybe 6, maybe 10. Back then we were small, and the world felt enormous. So we developed strategies to survive emotionally, to feel safe, accepted, loved, protected. Some people learned to please everyone. Some learned to disappear emotionally before rejection could arrive. Some learned to attack first before they themselves could be hurt. Every person built a different form of psychological armor. And at the time, that armor worked. It kept us connected. It kept us functional. It kept us alive emotionally. But decades later, the armor is still running the system. In relationships, in traffic, in conversations, in unanswered messages. The 5-year-old version of ourselves is still scanning the environment for danger, still terrified of abandonment, rejection, exposure, humiliation. And whenever something remotely resembles those original emotional threats, the alarm system activates instantly. The body floods with emotional chemistry. The mind narrows. And suddenly we react not as the adult we are now, but as the child we once were. That is why a certain tone of voice can ruin your entire afternoon. Why a delayed message can feel like rejection. Why one careless sentence can create an emotional flood wildly larger than the actual situation. And the truth is, it isn't disproportionate at all. It is perfectly proportional, just not to the present moment. It's proportional to something much older living underneath the surface. And once you begin seeing this inside yourself, everything starts shifting. You stop hating yourself for overreacting. You stop feeling confused by the intensity of your emotions. Instead, you begin recognizing the pattern itself. And recognition is the first crack in the wall. There's a question that has quietly transformed countless lives. A deceptively simple question. The next time you feel the emotional wave rising inside you, the next time you feel the storm beginning to build, ask yourself this. How old do I feel right now? And almost every time, the answer surprises people. You don't feel 35. You don't feel 40. You feel 8. Or 12, or 6, because in that moment, the body has traveled backward through time, and the mind followed it there unconsciously. But the instant you recognize this, the spell begins breaking. Because now, suddenly, there is an adult present in the room again. Now there is someone capable of sitting beside that younger version of you and gently saying, "I see you. I'm here. We're safe now." And notice what does not happen in that moment. You do not shame the younger self. You do not silence it. You do not call it dramatic or weak or irrational. Because that is exactly what happened when the wound was first created. Somewhere in the past, someone taught that younger version of you that its emotions were inconvenient, too intense, too much. So that part of you learned to hide underground, waiting silently until life produced another moment that resembled the original danger. And only then did it finally scream loud enough to be heard. But when you begin treating that wounded part of yourself with the patience, presence, and compassion you once desperately needed from someone else, something profound begins reorganizing inside your nervous system. The screaming slowly softens. Not because you forced it into silence, but because for the first time, it finally received what it had always been searching for: a witness, an ally, someone willing to remain present instead of turning away. And eventually, a quiet grief begins appearing inside you. Not the dramatic, kind people notice immediately. A deeper grief. The kind that arrives when you slowly realize no one is coming back to save the version of you that was wounded years ago. No perfect apology is arriving to undo the damage. No single conversation will suddenly rewrite your childhood. No person will finally appear carrying enough love, validation, or understanding to permanently silence the ache you've been trying to escape from your entire life. And at first, this realization can feel devastating. Because most human beings spend years unconsciously waiting. Waiting for the parent who never understood them to finally see them clearly. Waiting for the person who left to come back and explain why. Waiting for the world itself to eventually hand them permission to feel worthy. But slowly, something begins shifting. You start understanding that healing was never about forcing the past to become different. It was about becoming present enough to stop abandoning yourself in the same way others once did. And strangely, this realization contains both sorrow and freedom at the exact same time. Sorrow, because some part of you finally accepts that the past cannot be rewritten. Freedom, because the moment you stop holding your peace hostage to people who may never change, your life begins returning to your own hands again. This is where emotional sovereignty begins. Not in controlling the world, but in no longer allowing the world to completely control the condition of your inner state. Marcus Aurelius wrote something extraordinary nearly 2,000 years ago. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Most people hear those words intellectually, but very few truly live them. Because living them means accepting a difficult truth. You do not control whether someone respects you. You do not control whether people misunderstand you. You do not control betrayal, loss, rejection, criticism, silence, or abandonment. But you do control whether those things become permanent residents inside your nervous system. And this changes everything. Imagine someone hands you a heavy object. You always have a choice. You can carry it for 5 minutes or for 5 years. Most emotional suffering persists because we continue gripping experiences long after the event itself has ended. We replay conversations, rehearse arguments, reconstruct scenes, feed emotional fires with constant mental repetition until the nervous system can no longer distinguish between memory and present reality. And then we wonder why we feel exhausted all the time. This is why learning not to absorb everything becomes one of the most powerful skills a human being can develop. Not every opinion deserves entry into your mind. Not every projection deserves your emotional energy. Not every misunderstanding requires defense. Sometimes the deepest form of wisdom is realizing that another person's behavior reveals more about their internal condition than it does about your value. But this becomes difficult when your identity still depends on external confirmation, because then every criticism feels like danger. Every disagreement feels like rejection. Every silence feels personal. And this is where we need to go even deeper. Why do human beings care so intensely about what other people think? Why can one careless comment completely destabilize someone's inner world? Because most people unknowingly handed other human beings the authority to define who they are. Somewhere along the way, we began measuring our worth through reflection, through approval, through acceptance, through being chosen, seen, wanted. validated. But the tragedy of living this way is that your emotional state becomes permanently tied to variables you cannot control. One compliment lifts you. One criticism destroys you. One moment of affection expands you. One moment of distance collapses you. And eventually your inner world becomes emotionally enslaved to the reactions of others. But there is another way to exist. A deeper center beneath personality, beneath performance, beneath social identity itself. Many spiritual traditions call this the witness, the observer, the awareness behind experience, the part of you that notices thoughts without becoming trapped inside them, the part of you that can watch emotion move through the body without concluding that emotion defines your identity. And when you begin living from this place more consistently, something remarkable happens. Other people's opinions lose gravitational force. Their approval still feels pleasant. Their criticism may still sting briefly. But neither possesses the power to completely rearrange your sense of self anymore. Because your identity no longer depends entirely on external reflection. Think of consciousness like water. A tiny pond is easily disturbed. One stone creates ripples across the entire surface. But the ocean is different. Storms move across it constantly, yet its depth remains untouched. Most people live emotionally as small ponds. Every opinion, every text message, every expression creates waves powerful enough to destabilize their entire state. But the goal is not to eliminate the stones. The goal is to become vast enough that the stones no longer control the entire surface of your being. And this is the hidden meaning behind inner peace. Not a life without disturbance, but a consciousness too spacious to be shattered by every passing event. When you stop demanding that the external world regulate your internal condition, you reclaim an enormous amount of energy that was previously leaking through emotional dependence. Suddenly, you no longer need everyone to agree with you. You no longer need constant reassurance to feel secure. You no longer spend hours mentally defending yourself against opinions that were never truly yours to carry. And perhaps most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in order to maintain approval from people who were never capable of seeing you clearly in the first place. Because the truth is, some people will misunderstand you no matter how carefully you explain yourself. Some people will project their wounds onto you no matter how kind you are. Some people will dislike you simply because your existence activates something unresolved inside them. And if your peace depends on controlling how every person perceives you, peace will remain permanently out of reach. But once you understand that your value does not fluctuate according to another person's temporary perception, something inside you stabilizes. The nervous system softens. The mind stops chasing. And for the first time, you begin experiencing what it means to belong to yourself. The work was never about avoiding the stones life throws at you. The work was always about becoming vast enough that the stones no longer control the surface of your being. Most people misunderstand this completely. They try to imitate peace from the outside. They force themselves to appear calm. They act distant, untouchable, emotionally unreachable. But beneath the surface, nothing has actually changed. They are still small ponds trying desperately to hide their ripples. And eventually, the pressure becomes too much. The mass cracks. The dam breaks. Because real composure is not suppression. It is expansion. It is the slow process of becoming larger than the reactions moving through you. There's an ancient understanding repeated across countless contemplative traditions in different forms. Suffering begins the moment consciousness forgets what it truly is. The moment the observer becomes hypnotized by the experience it's observing. The moment awareness mistakes itself for the storm passing through it. And we've all lived this. We've all become so entangled in a thought that the thought became our entire identity. We've all been swallowed by an emotion so completely that for a moment it felt like there was nothing else in existence. We've all believed our inner stories so deeply that we forgot we were the ones narrating them. And when this happens, life becomes unbearably heavy. Not because life itself is unbearable, but because we have collapsed into a single emotional moment and lost contact with the deeper space holding it all. The path back is far simpler than most people expect, but simplicity does not mean easy. The next time you feel yourself drowning inside a reaction, ask gently, who is aware of this right now? Who is watching this anger? Who is noticing this fear? Who is seeing these thoughts spiral? And the instant you ask the question, something subtle shifts. Even if only slightly, you step out of the wave and onto the shore. The emotion is still there. The situation still exists. But now there is space around it. There is air inside it. There is distance between you and the thing trying to consume you. And this tiny movement, repeated thousands of times across an entire lifetime, slowly changes the structure of consciousness itself. This is what ancient traditions meant when they spoke about liberation. Not escaping life, but no longer being psychologically imprisoned by every passing experience within it. And this only becomes real when it enters ordinary life. Not during meditation, not during philosophy, during the argument with your partner, during the unread message sitting silently on your phone, during the moment a coworker takes credit for your work, during the family gathering where someone presses the exact wound they've been touching for decades. In those moments, two paths appear. The first path is automatic. The old programming activates instantly. The body floods with old emotional chemistry. The mind starts preparing speeches and defenses before the other person even finishes talking. The nervous system contracts. Identity shrinks down until the entire self becomes the offense itself. But there is another path. Quieter. Almost invisible. It begins with a single breath. Just one conscious pause. And inside that breath, remembrance returns. You remember that you are the one witnessing this entire experience. You remember that this moment, no matter how intense, is not the totality of who you are. You remember that awareness itself remains untouched underneath the movement. Most people never take that breath. They react immediately. Then regret arrives afterward. Shame arrives afterward. Exhaustion arrives afterward. But imagine if just once today, instead of instantly reacting, you paused. Imagine noticing the surge moving through your body, recognizing it as ancient programming instead of absolute truth, and choosing for a few seconds to do absolutely nothing. No defense, no explanation, no retaliation, just allowing the moment to move through you without grabbing onto it. You would be shocked by what happens. Most situations collapse when they stop receiving emotional fuel. Most arguments die when one person refuses to keep feeding the fire. Most provocations reveal themselves as empty the moment they no longer receive the reaction they were unconsciously designed to extract. Robert Greene once wrote that power often belongs to the person who says less than necessary. And there is profound truth inside that. Not because silence is manipulation, but because restraint creates clarity. The more reactive a person becomes, the more fragmented their presence becomes. But when your words are chosen carefully, when your reactions are intentional instead of compulsive, your entire presence changes. Every word carries weight. Every response contains coherence instead of emotional leakage. This is not about playing psychological games. It is about understanding that your attention, your nervous system, your emotional energy are finite resources. And handing them to every passing disturbance is not compassion. It is self-abandonment disguised as sensitivity. You can remain deeply kind without becoming emotionally depleted. You can stay open-hearted without becoming porous to every projection around you. You can love deeply without allowing every emotional storm to enter your inner world. This is the line we are learning to walk now. The line between openness and emotional captivity. Between presence and absorption. Between having a heart and becoming hostage to everything that touches it. And perhaps the most misunderstood word in all of this is detachment. Most people hear detachment and imagine coldness, emotional distance, withdrawal, isolation, a person who no longer cares. But true detachment is almost the opposite of that. It is not the absence of love. It is love without grasping. It is presence without control. When you are attached, you are not truly relating to another person. You are unconsciously trying to extract something from them. Reassurance, validation, certainty, emotional regulation. You are negotiating for safety while calling it connection. But real detachment changes the entire structure of relationship itself. Suddenly, you can listen without secretly searching for proof that you are loved enough. You can be with someone without trying to control who they become. You can love fully without losing yourself inside the experience. And this transforms every relationship in your life. Because most relationships are not actually built on love. They are built on mutual emotional dependency. Two nervous systems attempting to stabilize each other because neither learned how to stabilize itself. Two small ponds desperately hoping the other person will make them feel like an ocean. But once you become internally grounded, something entirely different becomes possible. You can meet another person without needing them to repair you. You can love without gripping. You can remain fully connected while staying rooted inside yourself. This is what ancient teachings meant by non-attachment. Not withdrawing from life, but finally learning how to participate in life without trying to possess it. Real detachment is not coldness. It is not emotional numbness. It is not building walls around the heart and pretending that isolation is wisdom. That version of detachment is simply apathy wearing a spiritual disguise. And apathy will never bring you peace. True detachment is something far more alive than that. It is love without clinging, presence without possession. It is the ability to fully experience life without trying to imprison it. Because the moment detachment enters, something subtle changes inside the relationship itself. You stop truly seeing the other person. Instead, you begin unconsciously negotiating with them. You search for reassurance, for validation, for proof that they still choose you, still need you, still reflect back the version of yourself you're desperately trying to protect. And from the outside, this often looks like love. But underneath, much of the time, it is fear. Fear of loss. Fear of abandonment. Fear that without this person, this future, this identity, you will somehow become incomplete. But real connection can only exist when fear loosens its grip. Otherwise, we are not relating to people as they are. We are relating to our attachment to what they give us emotionally. And this changes everything. Because suddenly, relationships stop becoming spaces of genuine meeting and start becoming emotional negotiations between two nervous systems trying to regulate each other. Two anxious minds hoping the other person will finally create the safety they've never learned how to create within themselves. Two small ponds trying desperately to feel like an ocean together. But the moment you begin becoming internally whole, something profound shifts. You no longer approach people as emotional rescue missions. You stop needing them to complete the parts of yourself you abandoned long ago. You stop gripping every interaction with invisible tension. And for the first time, love becomes spacious, clean, breathing. You can stand close to someone without collapsing into them. You can care deeply without losing your center. You can remain fully open while still remaining fully yourself. This is what ancient teachings were always pointing toward when they spoke about non-attachment. Not the absence of love, but the absence of grasping. There's a beautiful image found in several Eastern traditions that explains this perfectly. They speak about holding life with an open hand, because a closed fist cannot truly hold anything. The tighter the grip becomes, the more fragile the thing inside it becomes. The hand trying desperately not to lose eventually crushes the very thing it wanted to protect. And most of us move through life with closed fists. We grip our relationships, our identity, our plans, our expectations, our image of who we thought we would become by now. We hold so tightly to the shape we wanted life to take that we can no longer experience the life that is actually unfolding in front of us. And this constant gripping exhausts the nervous system. It creates an endless background tension running quietly underneath everything we do. Because gripping requires continuous effort, continuous control, continuous fear. But life was never meant to be held that tightly. It was meant to move, to change, to flow through us, to be experienced fully while present and released naturally when its season is complete. Watch your body carefully the next time something begins slipping out of your control. A conversation starts moving in a direction you didn't expect. A relationship changes shape. A plan begins collapsing. A future you imagine no longer seems possible. Notice what happens physically. The jaw tightens. The chest contracts. The hands subtly tense even when there's nothing physical to hold. The body understands attachment long before the mind consciously notices it. This is ancient survival programming. Somewhere deep inside, the nervous system learned that holding on equals safety. That if we squeeze tightly enough, maybe life cannot take away what we love. And even the illusion of control can feel safer than facing the uncertainty of impermanence. But anyone who has truly loved knows something painful about this strategy. The grip never actually saves what we love. It only destroys our ability to experience it peacefully while it's here. You can see this everywhere once you begin looking clearly. Parents gripping their children so tightly out of fear that the child slowly loses the freedom required to become themselves. Partners constantly checking, doubting, monitoring, demanding reassurance. calling it devotion, while fear quietly poisons the relationship underneath. And eventually, the very people we are trying hardest not to lose begin pulling away. Not because they stopped loving us, but because no human being can breathe inside someone else's clenched fist. And perhaps the hardest attachment to release is not attachment to others, but attachment to ourselves. To the version of ourselves we thought we would become. The younger body, the imagined future, the timeline we believed life owed us. We grip old identities so tightly that we completely miss the life actually happening in front of us right now. And when you finally begin loosening that grip, an unexpected grief appears. Most people assume letting go will feel instantly freeing. But often it feels like mourning, because in many ways it is. You are grieving the illusion that control was ever truly yours to begin with. You are grieving the fantasy that life was supposed to obey the architecture of your expectations. But beyond that grief, something extraordinary waits. Presence. Because the moment the grip softens, reality becomes visible again. You start noticing small details that were always there, but hidden beneath your tension. The way light moves quietly across a room in late afternoon. The actual face of the person sitting in front of you, instead of the projection your fears created. The taste of food you've eaten 1,000 times without ever truly tasting. Life becomes vivid again the moment you stop strangling it with control. And strangely enough, many of the things we stop gripping begin moving closer instead of further away. The relationship that felt tense begins breathing again once the pressure disappears. The opportunities we chased anxiously begin arriving naturally once panic dissolves. The peace we spent years hunting suddenly appears, almost casually, the moment we stop trying to force it into existence. Not always. Sometimes things still leave. And when they do, the grief is real. But often what leaves was never truly meant to stay. The grip was simply delaying a goodbye that life had already written long ago. What remains after your hands finally open is what was actually aligned with you all along. And now, for the first time, you can fully experience it without destroying it through the terror of losing it. Because when the grip softens, something beautiful happens. You do not lose life. You finally become capable of receiving it. The relationship breathes. The future becomes lighter. The present moment stops feeling like something you must control before it disappears. And you, the person who spent years clenching against existence itself, finally remember what it feels like to move through life with open hands. At some point, you begin realizing that an enormous amount of your life has been spent managing perception instead of protecting peace. Managing how people see you. Managing whether they approve of you. Managing whether they misunderstand you, judge you, reject you, or secretly compare you against some invisible standard you were never even aware existed. And the exhausting part is that no matter how carefully you perform, no matter how perfectly you explain yourself, no matter how much emotional energy you spend trying to control the image people hold of you, it is never enough. Because every human being sees reality through the filter of their own wounds, fears, desires, projections, conditioning, and emotional history. Which means no one has ever truly seen you objectively in the first place. They see the version of you their nervous system is capable of perceiving. And this changes something fundamental once you truly understand it. Because suddenly, you stop trying to win impossible battles. You stop spending years attempting to control interpretations that were never yours to control. Reputation and character are not the same thing, yet most people sacrifice character trying desperately to maintain reputation. Reputation exists in the minds of other people. Character exists in your actions when no one is watching. Reputation rises and falls according to trends, emotions, misunderstandings, and collective projections. Character remains rooted in something deeper. But modern life trains people to obsess over appearances. Social media amplified this to an almost unbearable degree. Entire identities are now constructed around managing perception, curating emotional signals, broadcasting carefully edited versions of the self in hopes of receiving validation in return. And the nervous system slowly becomes addicted to external reflection. Every notification becomes emotional currency. Every silence becomes subtle rejection. Every lack of response begins feeling personal. And without realizing it, millions of people have surrendered their emotional stability to invisible algorithms and strangers they will never meet. But this hunger for validation existed long before technology. Technology only magnified what was already there. Human beings have always wanted to feel significant, chosen, valued, worthy of belonging. The problem begins when your sense of worth becomes dependent on maintaining an image instead of inhabiting a truth. Because images are fragile. The moment someone challenges them, fear enters the body instantly. Defensiveness appears. Anxiety rises. Emotional contraction begins. And now your peace depends entirely on whether the world continues agreeing with the version of yourself you've constructed. This is why criticism affects people so deeply. Not because criticism itself is always accurate, but because it threatens the identity structure they've spent years building internally. And once identity feels threatened, the nervous system reacts as if survival itself is at risk. But there is another possibility. A quieter, more stable way to exist in the world. A way where you no longer build your life around controlling perception, but around embodying alignment. Around becoming internally coherent enough that external misunderstanding no longer destabilizes your entire emotional field. This does not mean becoming careless about your actions. Quite the opposite. You become more responsible, more honest, more intentional. But your behavior no longer emerges from panic about how you are being perceived. It emerges from clarity, from integrity, from congruence between what you know internally and how you move externally through the world. And paradoxically, this is often when people become most powerful, because people can feel when someone is no longer performing for approval. There is a steadiness to them, a groundedness. They are not scanning every room for emotional confirmation. They are not unconsciously shape-shifting to match every expectation around them. Their presence contains coherence instead of emotional fragmentation. And this creates a kind of silent gravity others immediately notice, even if they cannot explain why. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He repeatedly reminded himself that the opinions of others are unstable by nature because human perception itself is unstable. People praise one day and criticize the next. They admire you when you reflect their desires and resent you when you reflect their insecurities. If your peace rises and falls with those fluctuations, you become emotionally imprisoned inside other people's changing emotional weather. And most people live exactly this way. One compliment brightens their entire day. One negative comment destroys it. One misunderstanding consumes their thoughts for hours. They wake up already anticipating judgment before anything has even happened. They enter conversations preparing to defend themselves against attacks that do not yet exist. Their nervous systems are locked in a constant state of hypervigilance because they unconsciously believe safety depends on controlling perception. But safety built on perception is never stable. Because perception changes constantly, which means the only stable ground must come from somewhere deeper. This is why one of the most liberating questions you can ask yourself is incredibly simple. Is this within my control? The Stoics returned to this question endlessly because they understood how much unnecessary suffering human beings create by emotionally attaching themselves to things they cannot govern. You cannot control whether someone misunderstands you. You cannot control whether someone projects their pain onto you. You cannot control whether another person chooses honesty, maturity, kindness, or cruelty. But you can control your response, your integrity, your actions, your attention, your willingness to remain connected to yourself even when external conditions become chaotic. And the moment you stop wasting energy attempting to dominate the uncontrollable, enormous amounts of emotional strength return to you. Imagine how much life force human beings lose every day replaying imaginary conversations in their minds, defending themselves against scenarios that never happen, trying to manage how dozens of people perceive them simultaneously. It is exhausting because the nervous system was never designed to carry that much psychological noise continuously. Most people are mentally arguing with ghosts from the past while physically standing in the present. They are emotionally fighting invisible enemies while missing the life unfolding directly in front of them. And this constant internal noise disconnects them from reality itself. But when you stop chasing control over perception, something becomes very quiet inside you. The mind slows down. The compulsive need to explain yourself weakens. The hunger for external reassurance begins dissolving. You stop needing every person to understand your heart in order to trust your own direction. And that changes everything. Because now your emotional state is no longer being constantly broadcast outward in search of validation. It becomes rooted inwardly instead. Stable, self-sustaining, less reactive to every passing opinion. This is not arrogance. Arrogance still depends on comparison, still depends on superiority, still secretly depends on other people's reactions. What we're speaking about is different. It is internal steadiness. A quiet relationship with yourself that no longer collapses every time the external world shifts unexpectedly. And from this place, silence becomes incredibly powerful. Not forced silence, not passive aggression, not emotional withdrawal, conscious silence. The kind of silence that refuses to feed unnecessary conflict. The kind of silence that no longer feels compelled to react to every provocation thrown into the room. Most people believe power comes from speaking louder, defending faster, reacting harder. But often true power reveals itself through restraint, through the ability to remain internally unmoved while chaos tries to pull you into unconscious reaction. This does not mean becoming emotionally dead. It means becoming emotionally disciplined. There is a difference, because reactive people are easy to control. Trigger them correctly, and you can predict their entire behavior. But someone who has cultivated inner stillness cannot be manipulated so easily. They pause, they observe, they choose, consciously instead of compulsively. And this changes every dynamic around them. You can feel it immediately around certain people. They walk into a room, and there is no frantic emotional broadcasting. No desperate need to dominate attention. No unconscious leaking of anxiety through every word. Their nervous system remains regulated even when tension appears around them. And because they remain steady, others unconsciously begin regulating themselves around that steadiness too. This is one of the deepest forms of influence that exists. Not forcing energy outward, but becoming internally coherent enough that your very presence alters the emotional atmosphere around you. And perhaps this is why silence frightens so many people. Because silence removes distraction. It removes performance. It removes the constant noise people use to avoid meeting themselves. In silence, unresolved emotions surface. In silence, insecurity becomes visible. In silence, the mind can no longer escape itself through endless reaction. But if you stay there long enough, beyond the discomfort, something extraordinary begins emerging. Clarity. You begin noticing how many arguments never needed to happen. How many emotional storms were sustained only because you continued feeding them attention. How many reactions came not from wisdom, but from old wounds desperately trying to defend identities built around pain. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, your relationship with the world changes. Not because life stopped becoming difficult, but because you stopped giving every passing difficulty permission to enter and dominate your inner world. The strange thing about emotional triggers is that most of them come from places that, logically, should not have the power they do. A stranger online says something careless, and suddenly your nervous system tightens. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and irritation follows you for the next 2 hours. A person you barely know shifts their tone slightly, and now your mind starts constructing entire stories about rejection, disrespect, or hidden judgment. And if you really stop and observe this honestly, it becomes almost surreal. Human beings are allowing complete strangers to determine the emotional atmosphere of their inner world. People we will never meet again. People who know nothing about our lives. People carrying their own unresolved pain, projecting fragments of it everywhere they go. Yet somehow their behavior still enters us so deeply that it changes the emotional frequency of an entire day. Meanwhile, the sunlight moving across the room goes unnoticed. The meal in front of us goes untasted. The people who genuinely love us become background noise while random negativity becomes psychologically unforgettable. This is how unconscious reactivity steals a human life. Not through dramatic catastrophe, but through thousands of tiny emotional hijackings repeated day after day until the nervous system forgets what inner stillness even feels like anymore. And the deeper tragedy is that most people never question this pattern. They assume being emotionally controlled by external circumstances is simply normal adulthood. They assume peace must always remain fragile because the world itself is unpredictable. But there is another way to exist. A way where the external world can move around you without constantly entering and reorganizing you from within. This is what sovereignty really means. Not domination over life, but ownership over your own inner condition. Think about how much energy human beings leak every single day through unconscious reaction. Someone speaks carelessly, and we replay the conversation for hours. One criticism appears, and suddenly we mentally defend ourselves against it in 20 imaginary scenarios. A single unpleasant interaction contaminates an otherwise beautiful day. It's as if the mind becomes magnetized toward disturbance while ignoring everything nourishing, quiet, and real that still exists around us. And eventually, many people begin living in a near-permanent state of psychological anticipation, waiting for the next disappointment, the next conflict, the next emotional disruption. Their bodies stay subtly contracted all the time because the nervous system no longer trusts life enough to relax fully into the present moment. But what if the problem is not life itself? What if the problem is that we never learned how to stop internalizing everything we encounter? Neville Goddard once suggested something radical. He said to move through life as though everything is always working in your favor. Most people hear that and immediately reduce it to positive thinking. But it is much deeper than optimism. It is a complete reorientation of perception itself. Because if your inner state constantly expects attack, rejection, disrespect, or failure, the nervous system begins scanning reality for evidence that confirms those expectations. And once the body enters that pattern, it unconsciously broadcasts tension into every interaction. You become hyper-alert, defensive, emotionally reactive, and ironically, the very disturbances you fear begin appearing more frequently because your entire system has become organized around anticipating them. But when the nervous system begins relaxing out of constant defense, perception changes. The world itself starts feeling different. Not because reality magically transformed overnight, but because your consciousness is no longer filtering every experience through survival patterns built decades ago. You begin noticing how many moments never actually required emotional escalation in the first place. The driver who cut you off disappears from your life within seconds, yet your reaction could have poisoned your nervous system for the next 3 hours. The rude comment online vanishes instantly into digital noise, yet the emotional residue remains inside your body long afterward because you continued feeding it attention. And this is one of the most important realizations a human being can have. Attention is emotional fuel. Whatever you repeatedly give mental and emotional energy to begins shaping the architecture of your inner world. Most people think they are victims of emotion when often they are unconsciously sustaining emotion through continuous mental rehearsal. They keep reopening the same psychological wound over and over again through memory, imagination, argument, anticipation. And eventually the body cannot distinguish between what is happening now and what is merely being replayed internally. This is why some people carry tension everywhere they go. Their bodies are reacting not to present reality, but to accumulated unresolved emotional momentum. And once you see this clearly, something extraordinary becomes possible. You realize you do not need to react to every impulse moving through you. You do not need to believe every emotional surge deserves immediate expression. You do not need to enter every argument your mind invites you into. You can simply observe, pause, breathe, let the wave move through without turning it into identity. And at first, this feels unnatural because most people have spent decades strengthening reactivity through repetition. But gradually, a new form of strength begins emerging. You stop escalating every emotional spark into psychological wildfire. You stop treating every disagreement like a threat to your existence. You stop allowing random moments to dictate the emotional climate of your consciousness. And little by little, peace stops feeling accidental. It becomes structural, stable, something rooted inside you instead of dependent on external conditions behaving perfectly. This does not mean difficult emotions disappear forever. Human beings will always feel sadness, grief, anger, disappointment, fear. The goal is not emotional elimination. The goal is emotional relationship. Can you experience an emotion without becoming consumed by it? Can you allow pain without constructing identity around pain? Can you feel anger without allowing anger to possess your nervous system for the next 3 days? This is the deeper practice hidden underneath everything we've explored together. Not becoming emotionally dead, but becoming emotionally free. Free enough that your state no longer rises and collapses according to every movement happening around you. Free enough that your presence remains rooted even while life continues changing. Free enough that you no longer abandon yourself every time the external world becomes chaotic. And maybe this is why true peace feels so unfamiliar at first. Because many people have spent their entire lives unconsciously addicted to emotional turbulence. Chaos became stimulation. Reactivity became identity. Stress became normal. So when stillness finally appears, the nervous system almost doesn't know what to do with it. Silence feels strange. Calm feels suspicious. Stability feels empty. But if you remain there long enough, the body slowly begins remembering something ancient. That peace was never boredom. Presence was never weakness. Stillness was never emptiness. It was home. And perhaps this is the real shift happening underneath all of this. You are no longer trying to control reality through constant reaction. You are learning how to remain internally coherent while reality moves naturally around you. And from that place, life begins feeling less like a battlefield and more like a flow you are finally able to move with instead of constantly resisting. Before we continue, if something inside you has been resonating with this message, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below saying, "I choose peace over reaction." Not for me, for yourself. Because sometimes transformation begins the moment we consciously declare what we are no longer willing to carry. And maybe this is where everything finally comes together. Because by now, you may have noticed something important. None of this was ever really about becoming emotionless. None of this was ever about turning yourself into stone, shutting down your heart, or pretending the world no longer affects you. That was never the point. The goal was never numbness. The goal was freedom. The ability to feel deeply without being destroyed by what you feel. The ability to remain open without becoming psychologically invaded by every passing disturbance. The ability to experience life fully while no longer surrendering the steering wheel of your inner world to every external event. Because the truth is, human beings were never designed to carry the emotional weight of everything around them all at once. We were never meant to absorb every opinion, every projection, every conflict, every wave of noise moving endlessly through modern life. Yet that is exactly how many people now live. Their attention fragmented across 1,000 disturbances. Their nervous systems exhausted by constant emotional broadcasting. Their minds overstimulated to the point where silence itself begins feeling uncomfortable. And slowly, almost invisibly, they lose contact with the present moment entirely. They are physically here, but psychologically somewhere else. Replaying the past, anticipating the future, fighting invisible battles inside their heads while life quietly passes by in front of them. And perhaps this is one of the deepest costs of unconscious reaction. It removes us from reality itself, because reaction pulls consciousness away from presence. The moment the mind becomes consumed by defense, fear, resentment, anticipation, or emotional replay, the present moment disappears. And yet the present moment is the only place life has ever actually existed. Think about how many beautiful moments human beings miss because they are mentally trapped somewhere else. A child laughing nearby while the parent remains absorbed in stress. A sunset unfolding silently while someone scrolls endlessly through negativity on a screen. A partner speaking sincerely while the other person is internally preparing emotional defenses instead of truly listening. Life keeps arriving, moment after moment, but unconscious reactivity blinds us to what is already here. This is why peace is not passive. Presence is not passive. Awareness is not passive. These are forms of participation far deeper than emotional chaos. To truly be here requires enormous inner discipline because the mind is constantly trying to escape the simplicity of now. It wants stimulation, drama, prediction, control, narrative. It wants to keep reconstructing identity through thought because stillness threatens the structures the ego has built for survival. But if you remain with the present long enough, something astonishing begins happening. The nervous system softens. The compulsive need to react weakens. The endless internal dialogue loses momentum. And suddenly, ordinary life begins feeling sacred again. The sound of rain. The warmth of tea in your hands. The silence of early morning before the world becomes loud. The face of someone you love when you are finally present enough to actually see them instead of mentally projecting onto them. These things were always available, but reaction kept consciousness too distracted to experience them fully. And this changes your relationship with time itself. Because most suffering exists either in memory or anticipation. Regret lives in the past. Anxiety lives in the future. But presence dissolves both by returning awareness to what is actually happening now. Not the imagined future. Not the rehearsed conversation. Not the story the mind keeps recycling. Just this breath. This room. This moment. And perhaps this is why so many contemplative traditions throughout history kept returning to the same realization in different language. Peace is not something you achieve someday. It is something uncovered the moment inner resistance begins dissolving. It was never absent. It was simply buried beneath layers of mental noise, emotional momentum, unconscious fear, and compulsive identification with thought. This is also why progress on this path rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no perfect final state where you never feel anger again, never become triggered again, never experience sadness again. That fantasy itself becomes another form of psychological violence against your humanity. Real growth is quieter than that. It looks like shortening the distance between being triggered and becoming aware. It looks like recovering faster, softening faster, returning to yourself faster. It looks like noticing the emotional wave before it completely takes over the nervous system. It looks like pausing in the middle of reaction and suddenly remembering, I do not have to continue feeding this. And over time, those small moments change everything. Because eventually, what once controlled you loses its grip. Situations that once consumed entire weeks begin dissolving in minutes. Opinions that once shattered your confidence pass through without embedding themselves inside your identity. Emotional storms still arrive, but now there is something deeper inside you that remains untouched beneath the movement. This is the observer fully awakening within the human experience. Not escaping emotion, but no longer drowning inside it. Not rejecting the world, but no longer becoming psychologically enslaved by it. And from this place, something very beautiful emerges naturally. Compassion. Because when you begin understanding your own unconscious patterns, you start recognizing them in everyone else too. Suddenly, the angry person no longer appears simply cruel. You see pain underneath them. The defensive person no longer appears purely difficult. You see fear protecting itself. The controlling person no longer appears powerful. You see insecurity desperately searching for stability. And this changes how you move through the world. Not because you become weak or naive, but because awareness creates space between another person's behavior and your automatic reaction to it. You stop taking everything personally because you finally understand that most human behavior is projection, conditioning, unresolved emotion, and unconscious survival programming. This does not mean allowing harmful behavior without boundaries. Boundaries remain necessary, but your boundaries no longer emerge from hatred. They emerge from clarity, from self-respect, from internal steadiness instead of emotional chaos. And maybe this is the deepest transformation of all. You stop seeing peace as something fragile that the world keeps threatening to take away. Instead, peace becomes the ground you stand on while the world continues changing around you. It becomes less like an emotional state and more like a relationship with awareness itself. A relationship that remains available underneath every emotion, every challenge, every season of life. And once you taste even a small amount of this inner stillness, something inside you no longer wants to return to the old way of living. The endless emotional exhaustion, the constant reactivity, the addiction to mental conflict, the unconscious need to control everything externally in order to feel safe internally. You begin realizing how much of your suffering was sustained not by life itself, but by the way the mind continuously resisted life. And from that realization, a different kind of freedom quietly begins emerging. Not the freedom to control reality, but the freedom to stop being controlled by every movement within it. So the next time life triggers you, the next time emotion rises sharply inside your body, the next time someone's behavior pulls against your nervous system, pause for a moment before reacting. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice the breath moving through your chest. Remember that awareness exists beneath the wave. And ask yourself gently, do I want to keep feeding this, or do I want to return to peace? Because every moment of reaction is also a moment of choice. And eventually, through enough conscious choices, an entirely different way of being begins forming inside you. Not overnight, not perfectly, but steadily, quietly, like the nervous system slowly remembering the home it forgot it always carried within itself. If this message resonated with you deeply, share it with someone who may need it right now. Subscribe to the channel for more explorations into consciousness, awareness, inner transformation, and the deeper architecture of human experience. And before you leave, take one slow breath. Not to escape life, but to finally arrive inside it.